I want to look at two frameworks today when it comes to trying to understand a student's behavior and how to apply the best intervention so that they can thrive in the classroom. The first one is the escalation cycle, which really examines what is happening to a student when they're experiencing a trigger and activation that is tied to the behaviors that they're exhibiting in the classroom. And the second framework is called the internal working model, which digs even deeper into a student's background, strengths, how they see themselves in the world, how they see relationships with adults and with others, and also the stories they might be telling themselves, which is contributing to the behaviors that they are exhibiting. Overall, the goal of this presentation is to show that behavior isn't simply about defiance or disrespect or even attention seeking. When a child or a student is exhibiting a behavior, they are actually trying to communicate something to you. And our jobs as educators is to be able to help them identify that need so that we can do the best we can to meet it. I want to talk about the escalation cycle, which is a cycle that happens when people are activated because of emotions, because of a behavior, or some kind of trigger in their environment, and the different stages that happen within that, and also how one goes from the peak part of that escalation back down into a state of recovery. So to give you an example, here is a graph, and the different stages that we look at with the escalation cycle is baseline, or rather, what is the person like about 80% of the time? And then there is the trigger, which is something in the environment, or it could be a feeling, a memory, a scent. So many different things can create a trigger, which then starts the activation going into early escalation, which is a couple of steps before it gets at its peak time, where you start seeing differences in your body. There might be changes in facial expressions, a person's energy and breathing, which then, if not interrupted, then goes into escalation, where a person is in a full-blown activation state, which will keep going up into crisis, again, unless it is intercepted or intervened. And at that crisis stage, I think about that, what we think about in classrooms, oftentimes the child is at the point of throwing things around, yelling at people, not being able to sit still. That is the peak of that escalation cycle. But then after that, what comes up must come down. The next would be that starting into the de-escalation cycle, and this is when a person is still very much activated, or which it could include irritation and upset, but their system is starting to actually slowly start to decrease, but in this moment they are in no way ready to be able to think logically, because their frontal lobe is still offline. And so this isn't the time to do like talking interventions or anything. And then eventually they will enter into recovery, which is still actually not fully back at baseline. It is the point where kids start to show that they're able to get back on track. They might want to do a lot of individual work, but they are still not in that place to be able to think clearly about their actions until they eventually get back to baseline. So looking at this, there are a number of challenging behaviors that can present itself in a classroom and is difficult to de-escalate. And I think everyone who is an educator knows that to be true. So I want to look a little bit closer at these different points that we just looked at on the graph and talk about behaviors that coincide with it. So going back to baseline, this is what people are at the majority of their time, and it might look a little different for each person, but whether you're a student or a teacher, we spend the majority of our time in this place. This is a place where we're able to stay on task. We're able to comprehend expectations and also follow through on it. Our behaviors tend to be most socially appropriate. So, you might see a student at their baseline who's just sitting at their desk reading a book, or if they have sensory stuff and need to be able to walk around, they might be walking around the classroom, but that is part of their diagnosis versus a state of escalation. It is their norm most of the time. And then we go into triggers, and most people know what a trigger is. It is a intense feeling or experience in our body that can be called activation, where something has brought us out of this baseline and starts to disrupt our system, which begins the escalation cycle. So triggers can come from all sorts of things, whether that's conflicts or failures or changes in routine. It could be as simple as a scent of a cologne or someone tapping their pencil, or even a particular gender if a student has had a challenging experience or an abusive experience with a particular gender. So, and that gender walks through the door, that might be triggering for the student. And that then eventually leads to the early escalation where the student starts to exhibit behaviors that are signaling SOS. There are, distress. So, for someone whose baseline might be to sit and read a book or sit very calmly, if they start walking around the room, that's a sign that something has changed. Or another person might actually become less active and put their head down on the desk as a sign that something is activated. And so after early escalation, there is actual full-on escalation. And this is where you start to see behaviors that are often moralized as a student being good or bad, rather than looking at the behavior as a way to communicate a need. And so this is where you might hear screaming, or a student might stop following directions, or they might be, running around and throwing stuff around the room. And if the escalation doesn't get interrupted, it will go into a full-blown crisis mood, which is the peak of escalation. And this is the out-of-control behavior. This is when we have to consider the environment and our other students' safety. And so it can be throwing things or causing self-harm or even trying to cause harm towards someone else. It may look like a tantrum, even though I want to use that word lightly, because someone could be having a meltdown because of autism. So eventually what comes up comes down. And, like I said a little bit earlier, there does come a point where there is de-escalation. And this is when a person's body is literally been filled with cortisol and it starts to deflate, is I think the best way I could say it. At this point, you might see, the student, having avoidant behaviors, or withdrawing, or, even not being in a place where they want to admit what has just happened because of shame. And this place is still not a place to deal with any consequences or to have any deep conversations about the behavior or the need behind the behavior. Next is the recovery, and this is when the student is going to, start to show other behaviors that happen when your body is suddenly withdrawing from cortisol, and that could be like sleepiness. They might suddenly realize they're hungry or they need water. This is still not the time to be able to have that conversation, but they are starting to get to that baseline. And when you get back to baseline, you actually can start considering how should we approach this student based on their behavior. Now that we have looked at the escalation cycle in an effort to understand what exactly is happening when our kids are exhibiting behaviors that are less than ideal for being able to thrive in the classroom, I want to look at the internal working model, which is a way that we can dig even deeper into understanding our students' behaviors, what they are thinking, their beliefs about themselves, their history and experiences that has shaped the way that they are able to show up in class, and also other things such as sensory needs or learning challenges or diagnoses that might explain where the behavior is coming from.